Hotep, I'm Dr. Gloria L, Peace, host and producer of OmniU Presents the H3O Art of Life show. The title of our show is Consciousness, Spirituality, and Culture. And no matter what order you put those in, all of them are interrelated and they all need to be discussed at the same time. And I have the eminent person for that purpose, and his name is Wayne Sebamurti.
Thank you
Gentry,
so much.
I don't know about the Gentry part. We just keep Sebamurti for this part. I actually had a show with H2O, that's Hunter, H2A, Hunter Haviland Adams III, in which we talked about consciousness and spirituality. We did not speak of culture. So this time we're going to add that element so that we can look at the relationship between them. And the thing I want to say is that I once heard somebody say that trying to understand consciousness is like the eye trying to see itself. And so I know that, you know, that's a big chunk to bite off, but you can bite it off and chew it, and I'll be here to hold your hand.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me as your guest. It's a very big topic, and we will talk about all of this as a way for the consideration, because it encompasses so much within such a short period of time to discuss it. But perhaps I'll start with culture, since you had a show with consciousness and spirituality. We'll start with culture so that we can get back to that as we move through consciousness and spirituality. Culture can be defined in many, many different ways, and it has been defined in many different ways. And one of the ways that has been defined by Dr. Wade Nobles, he says it's a process that includes a design, it gives people a design for living and patterns for interpreting reality. And culture, of course, is a word that is connected to growth, as in cultivate, or when you're looking for a culture sample. So it has something to do with growth. And with human beings, it has everything to do with the maturation of the human process, becoming a full human being. Because you won't find anything human outside of culture as it is defined. And all that we look for that is human comes from culture. So it has to do with our maturation process. And one of the models that I like to, and the schemes that I like to use in talking about culture is how it manifests in 3 dimensions, and that it is basically a presentation of the collective consciousness of a people. That's what culture is. It's, in essence, its expressions and its manifestation shows itself as a presentation of the collective consciousness of a people. And you will see this in their architecture, their language, their arts, their music, their food, culture,
their rituals,
clothing, the rituals, symbols, everything that informs a human way of life, their socialization.
Now that's my definition.
Right.
Culture is the way of life, and so, as you point out, it expresses the consciousness of the people, and it's lived. It's the outward expression of the inward.
Exactly.
Consciousness of the people.
Exactly. Everything that you look at that is represented as a culture is a presentation of the inward collective consciousness of the people. And so you're always encountering culture when you're looking at a society of people and how their architecture is structured. Classic examples is the architecture of ancient societies, which were very much in tune with the indigenous culture prior to invasions and conquering of other people that whose aim was to distort and prevent people from living and expressing themselves out of that culture. But the architecture is aligned with the cosmos. And as the three dimensions of culture, the highest dimension is the deep structure of culture. And it includes cosmology, cosmogony, ontology, axiology, and epistemology. Of course, we don't have time to really flush out all of them, but I
just
would
do
just
epistemology.
do a
little epistemology, because it relates to how we know what we know,
right,
which is
exactly
on the way to consciousness.
Right. Epistemology, the sources and nature of knowledge. How do you know what you know? And what is it that you know? How have you come to know what you know? And that relates to the other ones, the cosmology, because at a certain point in time in the development of human beings, there was enough time freed up from just merely living in a survival mode to pay attention to the cosmos, because we now had gained control over the food supply through agriculture now, and that is connected to the cosmos too. But we can observe the movement of the constellations and the relationship to the constellations to
activities
here on Earth. And there was an understanding that became an intuitive revelation that the intelligibility of the cosmos was a reflection of consciousness, that all of this was being made understood through human consciousness, which had evolved to the point where it can make intelligible the patterns of the cosmos and then apply that knowledge to the living societies of a particular group of people, which came in out of the cosmology and the cosmogony and epistemology, emerged from that the core structure. From the deep structure comes the core structure of culture, which is the worldview, the ideology, and the ethos. Every culture has a worldview and has an ideology, which serves as like a matrix of ideas and concepts, which helps to present helps for things to be presented a certain way. You see things in according to the ideology and the worldview.
You see things like, who are we? What is our source? Where are we now? What is our condition? Where are we going?
Right.
Those are the kinds of things. And the thing I just wanted to drop in to say that one of the most difficult things that we have had to confront her and to defend ourselves against is this notion by people who conquered us that their worldview was the only worldview and that we had none. You know, just the whole idea that we had no sense of who we were as a people or anything about that, and that their worldview was the only worldview, and that worldview was imposed upon us.
And it was imposed upon us very strategically, and the vehicle through which they did that instrumentally was through, of course, the suppression of our culture and through the forcing of their language on us. Because language houses perceptions, and all of the perceptions that were acquired through you gaining knowledge of the relationship of the constellations of the cosmos, and how you learn how to, through epistemology, come to know what you know, all of that got suppressed because it could never be obliterated from us. But from the consciousness of the people that it was imposed on and forced on, there was a suppression that took place and an implantation of the language of speaking the tongue of the people of the conquerors. And that language predisposes you to see the world in a certain way. So now that you are forbidden to speak your native tongue and you're forced to speak the language of those who conquered you, your worldview has been suppressed.
And your knowledge base has been distorted or suppressed or destroyed. because now you have the worldview and the language containing the perceptions of the group that dominates you,
Right.
based on their quote knowledge or their quote fantasies. You can't say which is which here, but what you knew, what was agreed upon by the group is now no longer valid and no longer permitted.
Exactly.
It's invalidated by the imposed worldview and the imposed language.
Right, right. See, and that's where you cannot really separate consciousness and culture. It's like it's a feeding system that where one feeds into the other, because culture shapes the consciousness, and from consciousness that first emerges. And I like to speak of these three in a way too, as somewhat like a theme within a theme. And this is something that we've talked about before, as we've shared many very enlightening conversations in our own little private time. The knowing and the knower. Whereas culture encompasses all that is known. Everything that is known is culture is an embodiment of that. And you get to see what is known within the collective consciousness of a people through their culture, as it presents itself in their culture. And the consciousness is the knowing. It is the medium through which all that is known becomes known. And culture shapes consciousness now. When consciousness is in contact with culture, that culture now moves consciousness along certain pathways, and it's exposed. The consciousness is exposed, and it values what the culture says there is to value, because consciousness uses as its most chief instrument for learning attention. You learn through attention, but attention never just functions in a vacuum. It functions through attractors and directives, and the culture tells you what to pay attention to.
Exactly.
It tells you what's to value. What's of value? This you pay attention to. This you don't need to pay attention to. This is worth value, and this is not.
The human beings in your kinship group also teach you from your infancy what to pay attention to. Yesterday, I think I may have been talking to one of my children, and I was saying that, in a rainforest, it is essential that you teach the children that lions are carnivores. In other words, they must pay attention to the eating habits of the animal life in their habitat, because otherwise to treat a lion as an herbivore, a plant-eating animal, would be to place them in danger. Right. So you teach children to pay attention to those things in the environment that are beneficial, those things that are harmful, and those things that are not worthy of much attention, if any, at all. These are, and this has to do with the values,
right,
the inherent in the culture.
Right. And then the interesting thing about that too is that at the level of consciousness, most of the time, most people they receive an understanding of consciousness from a scientific point of view, that it is the brain that is producing consciousness, that is brain activity that produces what we're calling consciousness. But that is not the case. Consciousness is prior to the brain. The brain
precognition.
Precognition. The brain really functions somewhat like a receptor, like an analyzer, like a conscious wave frequency analyzer, a transducer, and a translator. And it's not what causes consciousness. And learning, being that the brain is not what houses the learning, memories are not confined to brain activities also. And that consciousness is not an individuated experience, although it can have localized expressions through particular persons. It's not confined and limited to that. That consciousness is a non-local reality, so it is universal. It is the ground of being.
Yes.
And the essence of consciousness is what we refer to as the I am. I am is the essence of consciousness, and it's an impersonality. That is not female, it's not male, it is not of any racial gender, racial nationality. So I am is a universal essence, presence of consciousness. And the learning of what takes place within consciousness, it takes place in a universal way, in such a way that it's, they have scientific proof. They've done studies of how little chicks that have newly been hatched and they've just coming into the world but not having any experience of the world, when a hawk flies over them, they know to move. There's something in them that there's danger. When a pigeon flies over them, they don't move. There's something within
the
DNA of the consciousness of that members of that species that has not been learned from that particularly individual chick, because they have no experience of the world, but it's within their consciousness. A scientist by the name of Rufus Sheldrake, he credits what he calls morphic resonance as a way of somewhat explaining what is going on, that your consciousness exists as a whole and is connected as a whole within whatever form that consciousness expresses itself through. When we talk about human beings being a manifestation in form through which consciousness expresses through, because consciousness is across the entirety of the universe, then all human beings have a connectedness, a oneness that they share. And I think Carl Jung, he called it the collective unconsciousness, archetypes of the collective unconsciousness. And that there's a learning that takes place throughout the whole of humanity. And it's a reservoir of knowledge that can be accessed, that is oftentimes reveals itself in dreams. And that in the Aborigines, Australian Aborigines, they have a way of accessing this. And it's referred to as dream time. It's a whole different way of being aware, awareness, but it's not dream as we are familiar with the term.
Not sleeping and dreaming.
Not sleeping and dreaming, where your mind is conjuring up images from things that you need to do or fears that you have. And it's something that's more connected to the whole of the race, the whole of the human family. And that the point I'm trying to make here as it relates to consciousness is that there's a learning that takes place at a much deeper level than what we are accustomed to thinking, how the channels that learning must go through it in order for you to acquire information, that you can tap into consciousness at its ground level, and then in doing that you can have access to the whole, what in the Eastern terms, the Akashic records. It's something that is non-temporal. It is not relegated to just the presence or even past, or even what we may call the future. That consciousness is non-local and it's non-temporal. So it's something that is very difficult to establish an understanding of if the way you have been trained and taught to think of consciousness is that it's an individual affair, and that it's about information coming into the mind, and this is how you learn. That is much more going on as it relates to consciousness than that, and that in fact that it is consciousness survives the death of the body. Of the individual. The form that consciousness expresses itself through, there are after death experiences for that consciousness. That death is merely a transition, it's an exit of consciousness from the physical realm of existence, but consciousness and life survive. It's before consciousness and life exists, before birth, which is the interest, and it survives at the time of death, which is the exit, but it does not itself exits or enters.
It doesn't move.
It doesn't move. See?
It is.
It is. See? And what moves are the inflections and expressions and the manifestations and the variety of forms that consciousness chooses to express itself through and in. And so that's why I say, as far as another theme of it, as the knowing which takes place, all of that, the medium through which knowing takes place is consciousness. And
but we think knowing takes place through instruction, through books we read,
right,
through people who lecture us, through papers, through television shows, you know,
right.
and this is where I remember watching Malidoma Somé talk about how he was taken from his village and educated away from his own people, and he was not able to return to his own people until he was 18 or 19, an adult. But he wanted to be initiated because he wanted to be a man. And in order to be a man in his village, he would have to go through the initiation process. And the elders were concerned about this because they were thinking, they considered that he might be in danger because he had another kind of literacy. He had learned to read. And their literacy did not come from this kind, through this instrument, through this means. Their literacy included knowing certain things by the way the dew was on a plant, you know. So they were conscious of their surroundings, and they were conscious of changes in the surroundings, as well as the presence of every minute part of their surroundings. And that was the basis of their knowing, where the basis of his knowing came from outside of himself, from something that people, you know, inculcated in him. And so they were very concerned that these two kinds of literacy might cause some sort of really damaging thing to happen to him. But he was so sincere, so insistent that he must be, that they finally agreed to allow him to be initiated. And then, of course, he talks about the initiation. But just the whole idea that we don't know anything from the way the dew is on a leaf. You know, we do not know from nature. You know, we started to know that something may happen when bees started disappearing in droves. When butterflies started disappearing, then we understood that bees pollinate the vegetation, and if there aren't any, then we might not get any plant food, and if we don't have plant food, not only do people not eat, but animals that people eat don't eat. So, you know, but such people would have seen that the bees would not have had to disappear in droves, because they would have seen, they had the kind of literacy that would have detected that. Subtle changes we don't even detect gross changes You know, the handwriting is on the wall writ large. We don't see
I
it
even see it.
because we got the kind of literacy that comes from watching television, and what they tell us on the news is what we tend to believe, or what we learn in school is what we tend to. It is what we claim to know.
Right.
It's a disservice.
Right. And that leads us to the third component of our conversation, spirituality, the knower, the seer. How do you see? And in which way do you see? What does it mean to see so that you can acquire knowledge? What means, modes, and methods and techniques that you, and I'm using techniques as a way of quickening the learning experience. Anything, a technology helps to amplify and quicken the usability of something, the utility of something. And there are spiritual technologies that are employed so that you can see things before, before it's just right in front of your face when it's really too late.
Right.
To see things before the happening of them. And this is where spirituality is much, much deeper than that, but it includes that, encompasses that, that you see, you're a seer, and you know how to see, you know what to see, and whereas consciousness is the ground of beings, spirituality and that which is spirit is the source of being. It's the source from which all came. And the essence of spirituality is no thing, the unmanifest, invisible, that which is
that about which we can only, toward which we can only point,
right,
about which we can only speak guardedly, because we cannot fully define or describe no thing,
right, because
since it does not exist as a thing or an object,
right, and you can't define anything
you
that
can't
has a
objectify
definition, right? When you have the definition of something
is a name,
is limiting it,
right?
You're naming it, and now the source from which those names and those definitions come, that is what you, when you said, like the eyes that cannot see
itself.
See, and spirit cannot see itself. It's like a scale trying to weigh itself. It can weigh everything, but it can't weigh itself. The eyes seeing everything, but can't see themselves, or a knife that is cutting everything, but it can't cut itself. The spirit is like that. But the way that spirit comes to see itself, the only way is through consciousness. This is what we find in the literature, in the ancient literature from the seers and the sages, that the way it is taught within the culture of a people is that consciousness is the medium through which you can know thyself. You know thyself and see thyself as spirit, but only within the medium of consciousness. That's how you know yourself. You can't speak about that from which speaking comes. You can't do that because you have to be looking and speaking from an angle about something that has no angles. But it can, that spirit can speak, and it does speak, and that which is spoken is a reflection of itself. And in looking at the mirror of what has been reflected, that's how you know thyself, which is the purpose of your life. As culture being a way of life, culture helps you to go through the stages of life in such a way that you come to know the life that is living. And the purpose of your life is to come to know that life, because if you, to know everything else without knowing the life that is expressing and living is amounts to learn ignorance.
Right. Which is, you know, why when I was talking before about education, you know, if the purpose of life is to know thyself, and what is being done in an institution is not aimed in that direction, it cannot possibly be education. But that conversation cannot be had in the context of a vocabulary that doesn't include it.
Right.
You see, because the vocabulary doesn't include culture.
Right.
It doesn't include consciousness.
Right.
It doesn't include spirituality. You know, it includes I guess buzzwords like quality education, which is utterly and completely ridiculous when you're talking about something that does not bring the person back to himself. Is not the ultimate objective. Whatever else we are doing here is to have that person to know thyself,
Right.
to facilitate that. You know, so all these other things will fall into place, you know, so you could know some other stuff. But the other things that you know about how to go to work and how to get a job or how to work on a job and all of those kind of things, those things are mundane things. Those things are necessary to support life.
Right.
But they're not. You didn't come to Earth to find a job.
No, you're here. Life, in some sense, a way that you can speak about it, to create another context for understanding the purpose of life, is that your living is also like a school. You're here to learn and discover yourself, to find yourself, your real self. So there's no such thing. What I mean by that, because there are after-death experiences for your living here. So if your education only include what's happening here while you're in this, to use a Tibetan term, bardo, this realm of the life, which is a continuum, because there's death, there's living, there's birth, there's dream, and also meditation is also a bardo. But after this living ends, life continues. So, and you are learning something in the after-death experience. You're supposed to be, and this is what the book of Coming Forth by Day, what it consists of. There are instructions that we don't learn about that here. That's not important for us to learn about that. And the assumption that is made in the educational institutions that...
No, not the educational institutions.
They're not educational, exactly. Correct me.
Okay.
You're right about that. The assumption that is made within the institutions
Of
that are
learning.
Training,
institution.
right, and in some ways indoctrinating, that's supposed to be guiding the learning experience of children, but still it matters what you are learning, what your attention is directed to. The assumption is that there's a standard form of education, and that it can be applied to every group of people, irregardless of their ethnicity. But culture is the shaping of consciousness, and you learn within the context of culture. There's nothing that takes place outside of culture. So if your learning does not include culture, which
the way of life,
your history, your traditions, your rituals, everything that makes up what resonates with you, if your learning is not encompassing that, you're not being educated.
Right.
You're just being trained, you're being informed to fit into a society so that you can benefit those who are in power. And this is what Dr. Amos Wilson called the falsification
of African
consciousness. And that's exactly what happened. It happens in three ways. They falsify our contents. They give us false information, false things that serve as so-called knowledge base that's incorrect information. Christopher Columbus discovered America and all these type of things. They falsify the information processes that the mind uses. They certain ways that you think, be it convergent thinking, divergent thinking, inductive, deductive reasoning. The Aristotelian way of using logic as a this or that, that's really not applicable to African worldview and African thinking modes. We're more broader than that. But our consciousness is falsified because we're limited into those ways of reasoning and thinking. And it doesn't really apply to our anatomy and our makeup. And then they give us false values, things to goals toward which we apply our knowledge, things that are false, that does not help in the human maturation process of what you are supposed to be doing.
Just carries us more and more adrift.
Right. More and more drift, more and more along mainstream, so that herds, so that you can be moving along, you can be guided and controlled and easily exploited. And this is a sad reality of what our children are subjected to and what they have to, the conditions that they live under when they enter into these institutions. Me, myself, was one, of course, and I learned all of that wrong, false information that inapplicable to a real way of life. Because in doing that, you don't get in touch with your authentic self, who you really are, and your consciousness is not.
You live as a caricature,
right?
As a cartoon,
exactly,
in a comic strip,
fictitious, false. The identity that you operate and function out of, the common term that is used, popular term, is ego. It's the false sense of self. So, and then that really is the basis for all of the problems that you have, because it's from that vantage point that you look out and you relate. But if that is wrong, then everything else that you do is going to be wrong and non-fulfilling.
And if you get a whole group of people who are coexisting, who are cohabiting, who are living in relationship to each other, and they are all other than who they are, and they are all trying to relate to each other on the basis of illusion, then you cannot have harmony, because you have people who don't know who they are relating to people who don't know who they are, who are all insisting that they are these false selves, and that these false selves are right or wrong about something, and it all is illusion, you know. But it gives rise to so much antisocial behavior, so much anger, so much violence, so much discord, because people cannot see beyond what has been ingrained or inculcated in them to look for. You know, they've got a pattern. They've already been given, you know, the rose arch. They've already been given the image. This is what you look for. You know, this is what beauty is, or this is whatever that is wanted to be valued. This is what it looks like. So this is what you look for. You know, and if you don't see it, you imagine it to be so.
And that's why the axiology that informs the culture at the deep structure must be one that is born of perceptions that have attuned with nature. And so this is where spirituality differs than religion. Because most of the time people may ask, what's the difference between spirituality and religion? And there are many different ways that they can be differentiated. But I like to highlight the fact that spirituality involves you attuning to natural laws. You're attuning to that which is, the reality of that which is. You are the reality. You are attuning your energies. You are disciplining your attention so that you can learn the reality that is. And spiritual people subject themselves through a process. This is a process. It involves purification, illumination, and realization. And it and whereas religion is more about conformity, attunement as opposed to a conformity. You're conforming to a way of really reacting to the norms of what has been set up in a belief system. You believing well rather than attuning and knowing. When you attune to the cosmos and you see the patterns, and then that attunement also includes the seeing process itself, and you learn about the learning process. There's no end to it. That connects itself throughout the whole universe, and then oneness is seen. You see patterns, synchronicities emerge, whereas you see meaningful things showing themselves, whereas life is not just about random events, non-connected. You see everything connected, and spirituality happens that way through attunement. And meditation is about attuning. You employ meditation as a means toward so that you can attune and see and realize the interiority of your being. But whereas religion, you follow literature.
Well, you've got organized, a group of people who have decided that if, as you point out, conformity, if we can get everybody to obey these rules and share these beliefs, or at least support them even if they don't actually believe them, such people are much more easily controlled.
Exactly.
So it's a form of social control. Whatever the other advantages and values there are into being a part of a group of people who may do some actual good work in the community. Might have a kitchen or a thrift shop, or a ministry that goes to the prisons or goes to the hospital to visit the sick. These are all very good things for people to do as a social group. It's always good to serve the social needs of your neighbors. But, there has, as you point out, there has to be the understanding that there is a purpose for your being here. And however much you conform to what a group of men or women have written down for you to conform to, if it does not address your purpose of knowing thyself,
right.
And if there is no practice related to how one approaches or endeavors to know thyself, then you might get high marks and they might have wonderful things to say on your obituary. But when the moment of transition comes for you, you will not be prepared for the learning process that continues into that realm.
Right.
And of course, there are people who don't want to discuss incarnation or reincarnation, as they say. I don't like reincarnation because life is a continuum, so you're not reing into anything. It's not it's not doing over anything. It's continuing on. But there are people who want to discredit such notions. You got one life to live. You have one mother. Everything. I mean, what kind of deity do we create that can only provide one of anything? We see snowflakes in abundance. So I mean, there's just too much evidence to the contrary. That there's far too much in just the limited environment that we move around in to think that you know, your life is, you know, the year you were born and the year you die.
Right.
You know, that this constitutes life,
Right.
and this constitutes what you call your life.
Right.
You know.
And as you had requested at the beginning of this dialogue, that we kind of emphasize the epistemology of the deep structure of culture. What do you know and how do you know? How do you come to know what you know? See, there are other means of accessing and establishing and understanding as
Like
knowledge.
the dew on a leaf.
Right. And meditation is another way of knowing. There's an intuitive knowing. Intuition is not an accumulative knowing. It's not an adding on. You know, it cannot be broken down. It's there. It's a matter of accessing. And meditation is a way of accessing inner knowing that can be applied in ways that are unlimited. And there's one other thing I really wanted to touch on as it relates to consciousness that is researchable and that really verifies the fact that consciousness is not just expressing itself in this body and limited to this body in terms of even acquiring information and knowing. And this is something that is researchable that has happened excuse me, and during the 70s, two scientists, Harold Puthoff and Russell Tarp, they were made in charge of a psychic espionage to the benefit of the military, but they employed some persons who were able, Ingo Swann, Pat Price, Joe McMonagle, a few others, who were able to have success at what they're calling now remote viewing. Is popular term for is astral projection, but to really shorten it, what they were able to demonstrate is that they were able to see and retrieve information non-locally across the globe and see and give information about what's going on in another location while they are located here as the Stanford Research Institute. And this, and Russell Tarp, he wrote a book called Limitless Mind. It's an excellent book. And he talks about, he uses phrases like what we really are is awareness residing as a body, and that we don't have limits and confinement in temporal terms or in local terms. That actually what you can know goes all the way back beyond what we're calling the past, and it goes all the way forward beyond what we're calling the future.
Well, you know, the Dogon, Hunter talks about this. The Dogon, it was said that when somebody finally arrived where they were in the remotest areas where the Dogon people lived, and they knew all about Sputnik, they knew what was going on in other places in the world, and they were in the furthest recesses of a rainforest. So, you know, to know does not necessarily mean that you need to be present. To know. In fact, the whole notion of presence, you know, where is your presence?
Right. As a conscious being, your presence is omnipresent.
That's exactly it. So, you know, while you are existing, you are also, I don't like to use not existing, but there's no word to fit in there for your being in realms other than the one that you are in at the moment.
Right, right. See, we're taught that the universe is a universe that is, the way we perceive it, it's a universe, and that there are dimensions within the universe, But there's other ways that you can perceive and talk about it as being multiverses, and that there are dimensions within dimensions. And David Bohm, he talks about the implicate order and the super implicate order. And much of what we have been taught through the mainstream scientists, the paradigms that have been established, they focus mainly on the explicate order and a little bit of the implicate order, but they never touch the super implicate order. And it really involves a lot deep, but he is one of the scientists, I would say, that really came close because he had a lot of contact with Eastern thinking that helped open them up. And he also was a meditation practitioner.
I had a friend, who was in India to be with a guru, he and some other friends. And one day he took it upon himself to go to where the guru was living. And just on the chance that he might be able to get closer, because the guru was always in this big, audience of people, so there was no opportunity. So he took it upon himself to go over to just see if he could see the guru. And they allowed him, somebody opened, came to the door, and when he said who he was allowed to come in and allowed to visit. His friends at the hotel insisted this very day that he was at the hotel when he was in fact with the guru and not there, but they say no. And I mean, they got witnesses, they each other. We all saw you because you was here. No, I was not here. I was not there. So who is to say?
That's interesting. That's interesting. We don't have time to speak much on it, but I remember Alan Wolf, the scientist and physicist Alan Wolf, speaking to Jeffrey Mesloff about torpedal projection with the Australian Aborigines, and he was speaking about his experiences of how they were able to do exactly the same thing that you spoke of. It's so little that we really know.
Right. And that's why epistemology becomes important. On what do you base your knowledge? How do you trust in what you know? How do you stand firm on what you know and know that you know?
And the interesting thing about the knowing and learning experience too in consciousness is that consciousness as a medium of knowing, it also is activity. It's not just knowing in a mental, there's this activity at all different levels. And when you're learning something, the mental activity, it sets up waves. There's a vibration that the frequencies that you vibrate at comes into sympathetic resonance with frequencies of other conscious subjects that are performing that same activity, and there's an amplification. So you're not learning something on your own by yourself. You're being helped and pulled along. There's attractors that exist, and that actually every activity that you perform is goal directed, and there are attractors that are along the way within the field of consciousness that helps to pull you along. And this happened in forms of synchronicities too, where you start beginning to pay attention to things as they are meaningfully connected, which otherwise you would probably designate or judge to be coincidental or random. Your attention somehow starts to move in ways where you see the connectedness. And for me personally, as I've shared with you, the synchronicities operate as validations. Whenever synchronicities takes place, there's a validation that you are on the right track. If you're thinking about moving in a certain direction or making a certain decision, and then you have an experience of synchronicities, that's a validation.
And people say that's a sign.
Right.
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 But you know, I have said, and I think this may be valid, you study to learn that which you already know. That came to me intuitively, because how would you know you knew it when you learn it if you didn't know it?
Right. And the reason why that is so is because you are it. See, you are it. And that's why. And when the ancients used know thyself, they wasn't using the know in a limited way that we understand know to mean, because in the English language, know only means know in one way. They were meaning for it in a much, much deeper way, because it encompasses who you are. And so, exactly, how can you know, how can you say you know it if you don't already know it? You don't already have the knowledge. You already have the knowledge.
So when you
are
meditate, you meditate so you can know that which you already know. You already know yourself. You already know thyself. But you don't know that you know thyself until you meditate and confirm that you know.
Exactly. And that's why it is also referred to as a recognition. See? It's a recognition. And Kashmir Shaivism, which is a spiritual tradition whose foundations were laid by the African Dravidians.
We got 1 minute.
Mohenjo-daro. They speak of pratyavijana, and that is a Sanskrit term that speaks to the recognition of consciousness, that you can recognize who you are. You never cannot be who you are, but you can be unaware. But through the discipline of your attention, you can come to recognize who you always have been and who you always will be, your authentic self. And when you live in awareness of that, it expresses itself as love, compassion, you're happy, you're not confused, and you establish harmonious relationships.
Well, I tell you, I have certainly enjoyed this hour with you.
I've definitely
and I'm
have
always happy to have you as my guest, Wayne Sebamurti.
I'm happy to dialogue with you, Guru Nanak, Dr. Peace, because you are wise and compassionate, and we